Good afternoon, everyone. I can see people are still trickling in, but let's get things underway. Welcome to the fourth in Fairer Finance's Consumer Duty webinar series. I'm James Daley, the Managing Director, and today we're going to be delving into the fascinating world of consumer testing. When should you do it? When shouldn't you bother? And what does it actually tell you? Over the last 10 years, we've worked with hundreds of firms across the banking, insurance and asset management sectors, helping them improve their customer communications. But it wasn't until a little over 2 years ago when consumer duty started to come into focus that firms started to ask us to test them as well. And of course, that wasn't a coincidence. The consumer duty guidance makes it clear that the FCA expects firms to use customer testing when pulling together its evidence to prove that it's meeting the requirements of consumer duty. But the more tests we run over the past few years, the better understanding we developed of where testing is useful and where it isn't. In the run-up to the introduction of consumer duty, a number of firms asked us to do tests which we advised them against. And as we've got the chance to run all sorts of tests, including some of those that we didn't think would be very effective, we've developed a good understanding of what types of testing work in different situations. And today we're going to share all our trade secrets with you, maybe even saving you a bit of money in the process by giving you the courage to stop doing some of the testing that you're currently committed to. So joining me to help unpack this rich topic are Fairer Finance's Head of Research, Dr. Oliver Crawford, and our consultancy manager, Eve McGrady, both of whom have worked on numerous testing projects over the last few years. After Eve and Ollie have shared some of our secrets with you in a short presentation, we'll be moving into a discussion and you'll have a chance to put your questions to us. So if something occurs to you during the presentation, feel free to start putting your questions into the chat or the Q&A. And before I hand over to Eve, I want to start with a quick poll to see how people are feeling about their firm's approach to consumer testing right now. So any second now, you should see a poll pop up on the screen. Give us an honest answer. The poll is: how confident are you that your firm has the right approach to consumer testing? Give it a second and then hopefully the results will come up on the screen. We might, if we can't show those right away, then we may share them with you later in the presentation. Okay, thanks very much for those of you that participated. Great. So anyway, wherever you are, let's see whether we can help reassure some of those who are feeling uncertain and perhaps test the position of those who are feeling more confident. So now I'm going to hand over to Eve to run through our presentation, and then we'll be back in a short while for a discussion. Eve, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. So let's start with the fundamental question: why bother testing? So as we all know, the consumer duty has raised the bar in terms of what the regulator expects when it comes to delivering good outcomes for customers. And by now, firms should have a clear idea of what good looks like for their customers. And a core element of getting good outcomes is, of course, customer understanding and whether customers have the information they need to make an informed decision, both at that point where they take the product out and throughout the time that they have that product. There are different ways to go about proving your customers are getting these good outcomes, and one of these is consumer testing. This is about gathering the right kind of evidence, depending on whether you're looking to prove customers understand your communications, understand how your comms affect the decisions customers make, or just to get some more general feedback on your communications. So moving on to the next slide, what does the FCA expect? We know from the FCA's consumer duty guidance that they expect firms to consider using testing to check that customers can understand their communications and also to learn and improve. The guidance is very clear that firms should take a proportionate approach to testing. So if you're a small firm with limited resources, the expectation is not that you set up a massive testing program for all your communications. Nevertheless, this of course doesn't mean that small firms are exempt from doing any testing. Firms just need to think about what would be proportionate. And the FCA makes the comment that firms should think about how much they are spending on other activities such as sales and marketing. So essentially, if you're going to make the case that it wouldn't be proportionate to test a document or a customer journey, that may not hold water if you're spending an enormous amount on promoting your products. So let's take a look at the next slide. We know that the FCA expects that firms prove they are doing all they can to provide the right kind of information in the right channel to help customers make those timely and well-informed decisions. But what constitutes evidence in the FCA's eyes? Well, the evidence base that firms can start building up could include some of the stuff on this slide here. For best practice, firms will be able to combine the results of internal tests with that of any external testing they've done. So, for example, you might want to test different types of communications for understanding and then combine that with internal MI that you already have on complaints. And then you can find out what customers are struggling to understand about the product. MIs such as quality assurance data and claims data may also provide useful evidence of those informed decisions. In some cases, it might also be appropriate to test communications on frontline staff who are going to be speaking to customers day to day. They can often be quite well placed to give insights into what customers are actually struggling with. Firms may also have data on response rates from communications. Of course, this may only be possible with digital communications. One thing the FCA has called firms out on is repackaging existing data to evidence customers are making informed decisions. So, for example, a healthy NPS score, whilst positive, won't be sufficient to evidence customer understanding. Customers may feel very positive about a product, but actually demonstrate poor understanding of its features and limitations. Taking a look at the next slide, what are some questions that firms need to answer? Well, when considering understandability, which is key to a lot of this, it's easy to assume that if you as the provider can understand your communications, well then your customers will be able to as well. But often these communications are written by product specialists who will have expert knowledge and they'll know their product inside and out. And that can, of course, lead the writers to overestimate how much customers understand when it comes to the features and the possible limitations of the product. And we know that this can be a blocker to understanding since legalistic language can be very off-putting to customers. This is something that the FCA has acknowledged in its finalised guidance on the consumer duty, which you can see on this box on the right-hand side. They say that effective communications should be understandable to customers in the target market and not just the staff who've written them. So firms should be testing these comms on customers in their target market to check understanding, and they should be able to answer the following questions about their communications. Firstly, what are the possible harms related to the product? Are those harms prominent and clear to customers? Next, are the communications we're sending to customers understandable? So can customers find that key information easily? Can they then use that information to make well-informed decisions? Of course, if testing then revealed gaps in customer understanding, the firm can take action to address these gaps. Firms should also be looking to understand how customers in different groups interact with their communications. So, for example, are the comms understandable for someone who perhaps has a visual impairment? Testing will enable you to understand how customers with certain characteristics respond to your communications. Testing might also help to reveal harms that the firm was previously unaware of as well. Now I'll hand over to Ollie, who's going to take us through some thoughts on which comms to test and how to test them.
Thanks, Eve. So, as James said at the start, firms will have an enormous number of communications, and obviously it's not feasible to test all of them. So there'll need to be some sort of system for prioritizing which communications would be most necessary to test. So what we've drawn up here is based on the guidance and the FCA's finalised guidance on consumer duty. just to run through it then, we've put 3 tiers of priority: high priority, medium priority, and low priority. So what characterizes a high priority communication? Well, these are the communications that inform or prompt a key decision and could cause a poor outcome to the customer if misunderstood. Now, that will vary from firm to firm, and firms will have to do some work to identify, okay, what are the really bad outcomes and what are the key decisions that our comms have that relate to those outcomes. These communications may also be sent to very high volumes of customers or sent out often. So some examples would be an insurance policy renewal communication. That's clearly prompting a key decision, right? To make sure your details are up to date, that you're happy to renew at the price that's been given. Late payment communications. Those are communications where there's clearly a bad outcome, which is that you might go further into debt, which could have all sorts of bad consequences. You might lose your cover, you might lose various other aspects of the product, or a wake-up pack in relation to pensions, right? That's clearly a very high stakes decision that's being prompted and an extremely important one for the customer to understand. What we've put in the medium priority tier are communications where there's lots of important information in there, and you could get a bad outcome if you didn't understand it, but it's more on the informing side than the prompting a decision side. So think of a policy wording. There's lots of important information in there, and often welcome packs have a lot of the same information in insurance, or a kind of distilled version of it, but it's not really prompting a key decision, or at least not at the moment you receive it. It's informing you about the product you've already taken out. It's important that you understand it, but it's not prompting that decision, which could itself trigger a bad outcome. Marketing communications we've put in this middle tier. Now, some of them might be sort of low priority, right? If it's a communication saying, we're a bank and we've donated a record amount to charity, that's not really got a bad outcome on the line. But if it's upselling someone to a different product, and this is a key moment for you to inform the customer about the features of that product, then arguably that's a slightly higher priority. It could even be high priority, but a lot of them will take the form of just informing customers about a product. And again, these are typically sent out to very high volumes of customers. For the low priority communications, again, there'll be information in there, but it's probably non-essential, right? It's not really telling the customer something important about the product. It's not prompting a key decision. And if they ignored it or they didn't understand it, there wouldn't really be a bad outcome. So a lot of firms send emails requesting feedback, for example. That's probably not something you'd need to test. Or they send kind of generic updates about the app, for example, or just an email confirming that you've booked an appointment, let's say. These would be examples of things we would judge to be low priority communications. Okay, so just to sort of run through the key aspects then, the sort of things that might indicate a communication could benefit from some kind of testing are if it prompts a key decision. So for example, if prices have gone up and the customer needs to decide whether they want to renew. If they could get a bad outcome, so I mentioned already the arrears communications. If it's targeted at vulnerable customers. So this is something, again, that the FCA's guidance talks about. Some comms will have a disproportionately large number of vulnerable customers in the intended recipient audience. So the obvious example are comms relating to recent bereavement. The people receiving those, by definition, are vulnerable. So you might want to put extra effort in to make sure that they're effective. Or, for example, persistent debt letters. Again, the recipients, by definition, almost are vulnerable, right? They're likely to be in a low financial resilience category because they're unable to keep up with their payments, and they may also have low financial capability. I've mentioned the high volume of customers already. That in itself is not a criteria, not sufficient criteria for testing, right? It might be a sort of generic feedback survey email that goes to thousands, tens of thousands of people. But again, if it's one of these higher priority ones that's going to lots of people, the fact that it's going to lots of people would push it further up the prioritization. And finally, this may seem obvious, but I think it's worth saying, if you know that the communication is linked to bad outcomes, for example, it's triggering a lot of complaints, then that would be reason to test to find out what it is that's going wrong and how you might improve it. But I would say best not to wait for that situation to do some sort of testing. You want to think proactively about how you might be able to get the most out of these communications and make sure they're effective before it gets to the point where lots of people are complaining. Okay, and again, to recap, the sorts of things that would indicate a communication might not need to be tested if it doesn't prompt a key decision. If you've already done testing on a very similar communication and are confident that you've got all of the necessary insight out of that, firms might have minor variations on these high priority communications, but may have already tested one of them. So for example, let's say it's a type of claims letter. There may be a very similar type of claims communication, but if you've already tested type A, probably a lot of the insights of that will apply to type B. Communication doesn't carry any risk of customer harm. Well, we've discussed that already. You might also have some sort of external evidence that this communication is fit for purpose, right? So it might be meeting benchmarks of industry best practice. So we do that here at Fairer Finance. We have our clear and simple mark, which has a whole range of criteria that we know through our own testing and through research that we've done. Are indicators that it's likely to be a clear document in terms of customer understanding. Or, there are alternatives. So the Plain English campaign has its crystal mark, for example. That is useful information that the communication may already be meeting the required criteria. And then similarly, you might have other evidence that the communication is fit for purpose. It's doing what it's meant to do. So, it might be a communication for someone coming to the end of their mortgage deal, and if you know that over 95% of people after they get this communication are switching to a new deal before it ends, then likely that communication is doing what it's meant to do, and you might want to prioritize other comms which may be linked to worse outcomes than that. Okay, so just as important as the what is the how. So again, we've sort of distilled things into a table. On the left-hand side, what we've got are ways of gathering customer feedback on the documents, the communications, and also assessing their comprehension. And on the right-hand side, we've got ways of seeing how the communication affects customer behavior. So let's just run through these then. An obvious distinction is between quantitative and qualitative approaches, and I'll go into a bit more detail on when one might be more suitable than the other, but there will be times when all of these approaches might be useful. So qualitative research might take the form of one-to-one depth interviews. It might take the form of focus groups, and they could be as small as 2 or 3 or as big as sort of 8 to 10. You probably don't want to go any bigger than that. You could do online surveys. The advantage of that is you can have much larger sample sizes that could run into the hundreds or the thousands. On the actual testing impacts, the obvious way to do that is through an A/B test. So to send 2 versions of a communication, an email, for example, and you could see what the difference is in terms of the engagements with it. So that's things like how many people open the email, how many people click the links, or you could track other things related to it. Is there a spike in call center activity? I already mentioned switching in relation to mortgages. Is there a change in how people are using the products? Behavioral experiments are for instances where you might not want to release these communications into the real world before you're really sure that they're going to have the desired effect. So there might be an outcome that's very negative and that you wouldn't want to risk in a real world A/B test. So you do it in a more controlled environment. So you would simulate the environment in which people get these communications and then ask them hypothetically what they would do after receiving it. So for example, if you wanted to reword the risk warning on an investment communication, you might give it to people in a hypothetical scenario and then ask them what they would do after they saw these different risk warnings. And then if you were confident that there wouldn't be some very bad consequence, people make extremely poor or reckless decisions, for example, then you could scale that up to a real world A/B test. So within these, there are lots of different things you can do. Comprehension tests are an obvious approach for testing understanding. That can be done through qualitative research. Obviously, samples will be limited. So, you know, the advantage of doing that through an online survey, for example, is you can get high numbers of responses to the point where you can begin to be confident that, you know, for example, the overwhelming majority of people do understand this particular point on the comprehension test. You can do structured feedback, so ask people to rate a communication on a scale for things like how easy the language is to understand, how clear the design is, how confident they are that they understand it. You'll probably also want to get some unstructured feedback. So in qualitative feedback, that might take the form of getting people to just think aloud as they see the document, what their initial reactions to it are. Or you could go down a more structured route. So you could ask people to highlight particular words or sections that they struggle with, or highlight sections that they say they would definitely read, sections they say they would definitely skip. That's all very useful information. And again, the A/B testing can be done in the side on the left too, right? That's not limited to testing communications with actual customers. You could do a series of depth interviews with communication A and communication B, or you could do a survey where some respondents are allocated to communication A, some to communication B, and then see the results. Okay, so coming back to the distinction I drew earlier about communications that prompt a key decision and those that inform. If we're thinking about communications that prompt a decision, the key thing you want to understand here is whether customers can immediately understand the call to action. Okay, so straightforward way to test that is to ask comprehension questions, right? So can they understand, for example, when it is that they need to make the decision by? Can they understand what the action is they need to take? Can they understand the consequences of not taking that action? Can they find the relevant information? So you could design comprehension questions to test all of these. It's also useful to gather feedback though. So this is especially true for qualitative feedback. For qualitative fieldwork, you can watch people interact with the document, ask them what it is they like about it, what it is they dislike about it, how they think it could be improved. And on the outcomes side, there's all sorts of things you could monitor to test whether customers are understanding it. So you can monitor engagement with it. So for example, if you're sending an email that's prompting customers to consider the range of savings accounts available and whether they could be getting more interest on a different savings account, you could see not just how many people opened the email, how many people clicked the link, but how many people actually changed the product as a result of receiving the email. And then on the complaint side, again, you could track whether the subject of the email is triggering large numbers of complaints or if there are any shifts in complaint volumes. So on the testing understanding and testing specifically whether people understand that call to action, that does tend to lend itself more to the large-scale quant testing, right? Because it's something, especially with the shorter comms, that you can test quite effectively through online surveys. So you can show the customer the communication, ask them those comprehension questions that are really measuring those key things you need to measure. You know, do they understand what they need to do? What will happen if they don't do it? Not to say there's not a place for qualitative fieldwork, but like I say, these kind of short comms that prompt a decision do lend themselves more to the quantitative fieldwork. On the informing side, the test here is not just whether people can understand what they need to do and what will happen if they don't do it, but also whether they can find the information. Now, a lot of these informing communications can be long communications, right? So I mentioned policy wordings already, welcome packs. They've got a lot of important information in there and information that the customer could suffer from if they didn't understand. The customer could get a bad outcome if they didn't understand. So for example, if they don't think they're covered for something and then wind up not making a claim, that's a bad outcome. But the information about what is and what isn't covered might be fairly deep into the policy wording. But what you're testing here is not just that they understand if they are or aren't covered in that example, but that they can find it, right? Being able to navigate the document becomes, in a way, the key thing you need to test for a long document, because it might be worded in crystal clear English, but if they can't find it, then that's still going to lead to bad outcomes. So you can do quantitative tests. They tend to become less effective the longer the document is. So for example, embedding a long document in an online survey and then asking people to find a bit of information and answer a comprehension question about it can be done, but it's harder to observe how people interact with the document. So you can't see them scrolling through it, for example. Whereas on an interview, that kind of user testing, you can get them to share their screen, or if you're doing it in person, you can watch them and you can see how they interact with the document. Okay, how do they use the contents page? What section do they think they'll find this bit of information under? Do they know that you can click on the links in the contents page to find the information? That sort of in-depth feedback is, I think, especially beneficial for these sorts of longer comms, and the informative comms are often longer comms. And I think that does, in my experience, lend itself more towards this qualitative type of fieldwork. Because like I say, you can watch how people navigate them, understand where things are going wrong better than you can in an online survey. But again, you can still monitor the outcomes linked to the communication in the same way with the other sort of very highest priority comms. So you can monitor engagement, see whether there are any noticeable changes in patterns of how people use the product after receiving the communication, or if there are complaints relating to that communication. That again will give you useful information on potentially what needs reworking in the document. Okay, so to bring this to life a bit, let's run through some examples. So I mentioned that qualitative testing is especially suited for these longer documents. So if we think about a T's and C's, or it could just as well be a policy wording, you could get participants to look at it, scan through it, get that initial unstructured feedback, ask them, whether they would read it. Okay, a lot of people we know don't necessarily open these documents or look at them, but they might look at them in certain situations. So again, an interview gives you the chance to say, okay, when would you look at the T's and C's? What would you be looking for when you did open it? Are there certain things that would make you more or less likely to open it or want to engage with it? And often those will be things unrelated to how clearly it's written, right? Often those will be design things, which again, you can get very useful feedback on through this sort of qualitative fieldwork. So for example, we tested a credit card terms and conditions, and we got some very useful feedback on how people responded to the document. So we had one, these are genuine quotations, from a study we did, which is published. So one participant said, "I don't like it when they beat around the bush with long words, and it just baffles my head." So as the interviewer doing the testing, you then know, okay, tell me which words you struggled with. That again gives you really useful feedback on exactly what bits of the document need to be sharpened up. Or another participant said, "It's so small, there's so much information, it gives me a headache." Okay, again, useful feedback on the design of the document. The font needs to be bigger. Or they might say, "I quite like the summary. It's very to the point and it had what I would class as the key things I want to compare." Again, that's useful. Not only do they like the summary, they use the summary, but they think it has the right things in it. So the challenge then is it in the right place, right? Can people find it easily enough? You might also ask comprehension questions. So again, sticking with this example of the credit card T's and C's, these are this is stylized data. This is not real testing data, but it's quite similar to the results we did get. You might learn from this, for example, that people understand exactly what the APR is that will happen after their 0% period, but they don't really understand what happens if they miss a repayment. And they don't understand that means their offer will be withdrawn, or they don't really know how how charges on cash withdrawals work. The fact that there's a different interest rate and you start accruing interest immediately. So what you're learning there is certain information needs to be made more prominent, either in the document or in the journey before they get to the document, or both, right? So this is the sort of thing that the results from the comprehension tests can tell you. In terms of structured feedback, you might see patterns in it. So this again is a stylized example, but what it's telling you is people are quite positive about the language, but they're less positive about the design and the navigation and the signposting of support. So things like helplines, links to third-party organizations, and that again can give you guidance on what it is you need to change about these documents to make them more effective. It might be adding clickable links to the contents page. It might be making the contact details clearer. It might be the things linked to the quotations we just saw, like font size or the hierarchy of information. Okay. And last of all, an advantage of doing qualitative testing is you can target it at particular groups of customers. So you might want to test specifically on groups of vulnerable customers, especially if you know that there are certain vulnerabilities that are found in your target market. So you might know that lots of your customers, for example, have low financial capability. Well, then you might recruit a sample of people who struggle with who aren't confident managing financial matters or aren't confident with numbers. And again, you could take this opportunity to ask them, specifically in relation to those characteristics, what is it that they dislike or like about the document? So, for example, we had this participant say she'd had brain surgery, and she really found the fact that it was all small text, so the little text, she really struggled with. And again, what that's telling you is you want to make sure that the key information is highlighted, but also that there's some variety in the design of the document, right? It's not just all black and white text of the same size. Okay, so on the quantitative testing, I'll just run through this. You want to make sure there are questions there in the background questions to capture those key breaks in the recipients, so that you can analyze the subgroups within the data. So there are obvious things like gender, region, household income. But then there are more specific things to do with vulnerabilities that you might want to capture. So again, you might want to see whether people who aren't confident managing money had a different pattern of responses to people who are confident. You could show people the communication. So in this example, let's take an online survey and then ask them comprehension questions to see whether they can find and understand the key information. Ask them those structured feedback questions, so get them to grade how easy or difficult they found the language, how confident they were that they understood it, and give them a chance to give that open-end feedback. It's really key to ask the comprehension questions, because if you just ask how confident people are that they understand it, you might get misleadingly positive results. Whereas if you have the comprehension question, you can see how far people's perceived understanding match their actual understanding. So again, just to bring this to life, you might find by doing the quantitative testing, you see certain patterns in the results. So again, these are stylized examples, but this actually does correlate with what we've seen in the real world. Young customers might be much less confident than older customers that they understand it. So you could then dive into that open-end feedback, which you could code into certain groups, like, is there a theme of people saying there's too much jargon, or they didn't like the tone? And you could see, okay, among these 18 to 29 respondents, what was the theme in their feedback? And we might find that the thing that they really didn't like about the documents was the jargon. And again, that would give you the opportunity to think, okay, were there particular words or phrases they struggled with? And again, you might ask a question to explicitly get them to mention any words or phrases they found difficult. Or you might do some follow-up qualitative testing to work out exactly why people dislike certain words, or if they find certain words difficult. Okay, so once you've done the testing, it's important to write it up and to draw out any recommendations, to share that report with those recommendations and the summaries with the relevant stakeholders, of whom there could be many, right? And the insight teams, copywriters, designers, compliance teams. If there are, recommendations, make sure that you have a plan for implementing them and timelines for putting those into action, updating the board and putting these into board reports as necessary. And then one key one is you can then use that to improve your internal processes. So you might have internal guidance about how to write clear communications. If your testing reveals something interesting about, say, for example, a particular group of vulnerable customers responds positively to a certain type of phrasing, then that can go into your internal guidance on how to write good communications, or it might be your training materials. And again, it's important to store all this information so the lessons aren't forgotten, so that you can apply them from one set of communications to another, and also crucially, so you can contextualize future results. You might get 70% of people understanding a bit of information correctly, but in itself, that might not tell you anything, right? You want to see how does that compare to other similar communications to know whether that's a good result or a result that could be better. Okay, so I'll just quickly run through some advantages and limitations. A key advantage then is that it gives you some external validation that the key message of the communication can be understood. So if there's an obvious thing that customers need to do when they get this communication, and you found that 90% of people can answer that correctly from, you know, a sample of over 400, then you have some useful evidence that people understand the key information there. It also gives you feedback from a diverse range of customers, and that includes vulnerable customers in your intended market. And some of that will be things that you wouldn't otherwise have considered. So there might be things that are especially effective for dyslexic customers that the people composing the communications just wouldn't have considered when putting them together. Like with the example I gave of the credit cards, they might show you certain things that customers are really struggling with, and that again can direct you for how to rewrite or redesign these communications. What information needs to be made more prominent? What is it about the design that needs to be tweaked? And on the A/B testing, you can see what kind of interventions are more effective. So for example, if you change a subject line from important information about your savings account to the rates on your savings account are going up to X on date Y, and you can see that that has a noticeable effect on how people respond, then that lesson can be applied more broadly to other similar communications. There are limitations though, and I think that's worth mentioning. So the most obvious one is that when you're testing these, not through the A/B testing with real communications, but in an online survey or in interviews or focus groups, you're likely to get people who are a bit more engaged than the typical customer. So you're making them look at it and then answer questions about it. And in the real world, the customer might not look at it at all, or they might only scan it very briefly. So although it tests well in the test, it might not have exactly those results in the real world. There's also a kind of bias towards participants wanting to say what they think the interviewer wants to hear, or the survey designer, which might skew things in a positive direction. And like I mentioned earlier, participants can overestimate how much they understand. So you might get 90% of people strongly agreeing that they understand the communication, but unless you have that comprehension test, that in itself is not sufficient evidence. Samples might be skewed or limited. That's especially true for the qualitative fieldwork. And lastly, customers might not know the best way to write or design a communication. So I think it's most effective, this kind of data, when it's used in conjunction with other information on how to write good communications. So expert guidance on what makes an effective subject line, what are useful headings to have in a communication is also important, as well as just getting the views of customers. Okay. I'll hand over to James now for the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ollie. Really interesting. Now, before we move into discussion, I think you might have the results of the poll that we did at the outset. We're still mastering the technology here, so I'm not sure if we can share it on the screen. But if we can't do that,
I can walk you through it now.
Can you share verbally?
Yeah, so we had 3% of respondents saying they were extremely confident, 50%, so the most common response was fairly confident, and then people were basically evenly split between the middle option, neither unconfident or confident, 23%, fairly unconfident, 23%, and not at all confident, 3%. So most were either extremely or fairly confident.
All right. Well, hopefully those percentages have already gone up, but don't worry, we're not going to torture you and rerun the poll. But let's get into some questions, because we've had loads while your presentation's been going on, which is a good sign. So Eve's going to chair this part of the discussion, and don't worry if we don't get to your question before 1 o'clock. We'll try and get back to you with an answer after today's webinar. But Eve's going to chair the discussion now. So Eve, over to you.
Thanks very much, James. And yeah, please do continue to leave your questions in the chat. But we'll kick off with one which I'm going to ask you, James. Lloyd asks, what is the most effective way to evidence testing, particularly if you ever needed to provide evidence of testing for multiple documents?
Well, I think that ultimately you need to start with what you're trying to prove here. Almost I want to challenge the premise of the question, which is you don't necessarily have to evidence that you're testing. You have to show you've got enough evidence that you're delivering good customer outcomes. And if testing is going to make a compelling case that you are, or it's going to give you the insight to help you understand where you can improve, then that's a key part of your evidence base. But, as Ollie alluded to in his presentation there, If actually you've got MI showing that you are delivering the outcome that you want from a communication, even if objectively you can see it's quite bad, and it's got a bit of jargon and all the rest of it, that might not need to be as high priority. I think you have to look at where you are and what needs the most attention today. So, if you're delivering a great outcome and you know that this communication could be written better, you might want to put that aside and come back to it sort of when you get round to phase 2 of consumer duty, but focus on the stuff where today you can see there are problems. And, often the key to understanding where there are problems is looking at complaints that are coming in, or, using that MI to see whether customers are taking the right actions at key moments in the product life cycle, and seeing whether your evidence shows that they're making those. And if they're not, then testing and improving communications may be one thing you want to do, but it may not be the only tool in your armory. Hopefully that's helpful. I've reframed it slightly there, but I'm sure we'll touch on all of those themes as we carry on through these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And one theme actually that's come up a couple of times is around kind of cheaper ways of testing if you're a smaller firm with smaller resources. So, Ollie, I'd like to come to you on this one from Andy. We mentioned using frontline staff as a way of testing communication. So Andy says, staff may also be customers. Have you seen testing with staff as possibly a quicker or cheaper way of testing? That's something that we mentioned in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen firms do some testing with staff, and I think that is a useful way to get some feedback. I would also say, if you're devising customer testing, it's useful to get a wide range of staff input if you can into how you're designing the surveys or the interview question sets, because that's also something that benefits from a range of feedback. One of the key things is getting the questions right, and getting a wide range of feedback on how you've designed the testing often will dramatically improve how effective your surveys are, to make sure that you haven't asked things in a confusing way, or that you're sort of getting at the key things that people need to know from the communication. And I think also doing dry runs on staff before you release a survey or an interview into a large number of customers is another useful process that firms can do. But I think, yes, if resources are limited and you, for example, test understanding of, let's say, a policy wording, are you covered or not covered in this particular for this particular type of claim, and your staff who probably have above average levels of knowledge of the product, some might be customers, like you say, if you find that lots of them are getting it wrong, then that is useful information for you about, okay, maybe we need to think about how we might revise this communication.
One thing I've seen in some firms is creating sort of clear communication stakeholder groups. So they're creating a new letter, and they think, right, okay, we think this is good. We've done a decent job on sort of following the principles of clear communication, but let's now sort of gather stakeholders from across the business, including some of those frontline teams, who are dealing with the customers on a sort of day in, day out basis, and see whether or not we can improve it. And I think that's absolutely a valid approach. Actually, sort of the counter to that is I've worked with firms who, when they've spoken to the frontline staff, have said, if only you'd shown us this stuff before you put it live, we could have told you that it wasn't going to deliver the outcomes that you wanted, and that a lot of customers wouldn't have understood it. I think it just illustrates there's not one right answer to testing. It's about sort of showing that you're making the right efforts to learn and improve all the time and try and deliver those good customer outcomes, but never kind of lose sight of what it's all for, which is the outcomes in the end.
And in terms, James, of showing that you're making an effort, we've actually had a question from Thomas about accreditations. So Thomas says, do you feel there are any benefits in having an accreditation mark on a specific document instead of customer testing?
So, I mean, obviously, we have to declare an interest here and that we have an accreditation, and other accreditations are available. But, look, I mean, what we do in our accreditation is assess a document, the language, the design, against some criteria which, you know, is researched and known to make something easier to understand. So, you know, reading age, for example, or reading grade, you know, as you know, is just a formula that looks at the average length of sentences and the average length of words in those sentences. And there's lots of research to show that documents with shorter sentences and shorter words in those sentences are easier for people to understand. So, you know, what some of these accreditations do is say, look, you've hit the basics here. You're passing, you know, you've got a reasonable reading grade. You haven't got, you know, an unwieldy amount of jargon that people aren't going to understand. You've structured your document in a way that's intuitive for the customer to find what they might be looking for, and you know, hit key design criteria like having a reasonable font size, not having color contrast issues that make it difficult for colorblind people to read your document, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I do think that that's a reasonable first step for people to take, particularly in terms of longer documents. You know, we've done sessions about clearer communications before, and we see policy wordings, T's and C's as manuals. You know, and I think it's about, you know, it's quite hard to test a big, lengthy manual, a T's and C's document effectively, particularly, you know, in sort of focus groups and quant testing. It's not impossible, but, you know, it's a very artificial environment, and you have to be careful about what you get from the results of that. And so, you know, in those situations, knowing, well, the way people are going to use these is to pull the manual, go to the contents page, try and find the prompt that takes them to the part of the document that's going to include the information they need, and when they get there, they can understand it. Having sort of been able to say to a regulator, look, you know, this meets all these criteria that you know, some people that know about this stuff have said is going to help it make it more readable. You know, that's part of your evidence base. So yeah, absolutely something to consider, but it's not necessarily a replacement, especially when you get into those shorter form communications that have that call to action, you know, where I think testing, you know, really starts to be more powerful.
Thanks, James. And another theme that's coming up in the questions is, well, how often should we be doing testing? So Ollie, we've got a question from Azra who says, how regularly should you test documents and web pages? And she also asks, do you have a steer on sample size for the quant studies?
Yeah, well, sort of taking the second part first, I think it will depend on partly on resources, right? Larger sample sizes tend to be more expensive. You know, if you're in sort of over 400s, then, you know, you can probably have reasonable confidence that, for example, you know, if you're getting 80 to 90% of people understanding a particular comprehension question, then, you know, that seems like strong evidence that people can find and understand that bit of information. Although you may have significant segments of vulnerable customers, for example, where your sample size is going to be much smaller, and so it's harder to draw strong conclusions about that. Although you might still have some indicative data from the splits within the sample. But if you went bigger, right, if you had 1,000 or 2,000, then you would start to have, you know, significant samples for those subgroups. But again, that can start to become very expensive. On the regularity, I think there are a few things to bear in mind. One is that, let's say you're launching a new product, then that's a logical time to test is before it goes live. So, for example, the journey, to make sure that people understand the key features of the product or its limitations. Obviously, you want to have some assurance of that before you go live with the product. If you're making a substantial revision to the product or the communication, that again, I think is a logical time to test again. So to make sure that people understand what the benefits or limitations are of this new range of product. Let's say you had 3 tiers before and now you've shifted to 2, or you might have had just 1 tier and now you've got 3 tiers. Again, you would want assurance that customers understand the difference between those. if you've made a major revision to a high priority communication, I think that again is grounds for potentially doing some more testing. So let's say you want to completely rewrite your arrears letters, and that's such a high priority communication. You would want to be confident that it was meeting its requirements, that customers understood it and responded positively to it before you went live with it. The trickier part then is everything else, right? The routine testing. And I think, again, it will depend on the size of the firm and their resources. I would say, though, that these very high priority communications, you might want to test a sample of those fairly often to make sure they're still fit for purpose, just because, again, the consequences of them being not fit for purpose are that much worse. So, you might want to do some testing every year on those high priority communications, potentially not all of them, but a sample of them, to make sure that they're still meeting customers' needs. For the lower priority ones, they might be on a more lax regular testing schedule. So it might be 2 to 3 years.
I think one of the things you've got to think about as well is that there's obviously test and learn and improve. And what we're still relatively early on that journey for a lot of companies. They've done a first round of testing, maybe they've made some improvements, maybe they've done a second. But after a while, you do start to see a kind of plateau. It's very hard to actually get to the point where 100% of people are understanding everything in a communication. Obviously, 1 in 6 people in the UK has a reading age of less than 11. Some people really struggle with literacy. So you have to sort of have a reasonable view about whether you can get a document to be as clear as possible. But obviously, if you're also testing, are people acting on this piece of information that we're sending them? Once you've got it to a reasonable level, testing it sort of year in, year out might not be what's important. But having a broader understanding about how the ways consumers interact with the different communications they're sent is quite important, because you might start, we know some firms have introduced text messages for the first time into the communications they're sending to customers to try and elevate a particular message at a key point in the customer life cycle. But if we all start to get inundated with text messages from all our financial services providers and other service providers, then at some point, that might stop being an effective form of communication. So we're all going to have to sort of keep an eye on changing ways in which we engage with, communications that's sent to us. And I think most people know now that, letters are not a great form of communication for a lot of people. People just get worse and worse at opening letters and reacting to letters. Whereas, SMS are reasonably effective at the moment, or app notifications, particularly effective, because you can have the confidence they're coming from the provider because you've downloaded the app. But it's going to be an evolving sort of social science, and one that we're all going to have to keep abreast of.
And in terms of thinking about testing different types of communications, we've got a question related to testing longer documents. So Claire asked, some documents are too long to test, e.g. 60 pages long policy documents. Is it valid to test just particular sections of these? Similarly, packs of different documents that are sent to customers, how do you test these effectively? Ollie, I don't know, or James, if you had an initial thought on that.
Well, I wanted to say, again, what are you trying to prove? Like, the idea that you might sort of test a bit of it, absolutely. If that there's a particular problem in understanding of the subsidence section of your home insurance policy, for example, you might think we're going to rewrite that and then we're going to test that bit because we're seeing complaints to it. But if you're sort of doing that as a proxy for sort of proving that you're doing some testing, then that might not be the right approach. I do think that hopefully what's landing from today's session is that start with the outcomes and building your evidence, and then think, where will testing add to that evidence base in a credible way. But yeah, Ollie, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I've tested quite a lot of policy wordings, terms and conditions. I would say, just to build on what James just said, if you just test a section of it, that then can't be evidence that people understand the whole thing, or necessarily understands that bit of information as it appears in that document. Because, as I mentioned earlier, with a long document, a lot of the challenge is finding the information, right? So if you test the whole thing, which you can do through quantitative methods, right? So you could have it in a survey and then give people a scenario, right? So imagine you're in this situation, go and find this bit of information and then answer a question about it. But it's generally more effective to do that qualitatively, right? Where you can observe how they navigate the document. And what you'll find is you'll see sort of intuitively where they think that information might be. And then if they can find it, it might be in a different section to where they thought it would be, which would give you cues on how to structure the document perhaps a bit differently. But also you can then start to discuss these prior questions, right? So would they even look in the T's and C's or the policy wording for that bit of information? Where else might they look for it? What situations do they look at policy wordings, T's and C's? If there's a page where they access these things and there might be multiple documents on that page, do they know which one to look for to find that bit of information? Is there a bit of guidance you can give them on that page to tell them, okay, this document is where you find this bit of information? So that sort of larger contextual piece about finding the information and how to present these documents, you will get by testing the documents as a whole, and perhaps testing the journey that leads up to it too.
Yeah, I mean, we're both, we're both remembering a project that we had in the past where we've actually written a document more clearly, but seen it test poorly than the first one because the structure wasn't sorted properly. So in a very long document, we hadn't been involved in the sort of structural part of that, and then people couldn't get to the information. So what we were sort of suggesting to the client we were working with is actually you've got to have a really clear T's and C's contents page here to help people get to it, because if you just test and say, tell me the answer to this comprehension question in a 60-page document, people are really struggling if they're just doing Control F. Even if the language is beautiful once they get there, you have to think about those longer documents as manuals. So yeah, certainly some stuff to think about there. Maybe one very quick question. We're almost out of time.
Yeah, one final one from Dan, who says, from speaking with peers, some firms use scorecards to rank comms, and if they need testing, is this recommended? If so, is there a template or format that you would suggest? James, don't know if you want to come in on this one first.
Oh, scorecards to test comms. I'm a bit lost there on that. As have you done any of that, Ollie?
Yeah, I think having a clear prioritization system, and if you have a methodology that makes sense and draws on what the FCA said in its finalized guidance about how to prioritize communications, then absolutely it makes sense to build that into a framework or a scorecard, which you can then use to work out what the prioritization is of your communications, because that there will be hundreds, if not thousands of them. So you need some way of prioritizing them. So yes, I think that makes sense, and it is something we've done with firms, is help them draw up these sorts of things.
Oh, I'm glad you're here to answer that one. Good. All right. Well, look. Hopefully you all found that useful. I think that's about all we've got time for today. I want to get you away on time and make sure you can go and get some lunch if you're not eating it already. As ever, we'll be making the slides and recording from today available, so you can have a look at those slides in more detail and share this with colleagues if that's useful. And if there's anything that you'd like to follow up with us afterwards, then of course, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's it for our webinars or webinars even this year, but we'll be back in the new year with a new schedule. And if there's any topics that you'd like to see us cover, do get in touch and let us know. But thanks very much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon and bye for now.